Reagan administration starts a different policy toward antitrust or toward monopolies. Isn't it really focusing on the idea that so long as prices get lower for consumers in the short term, that is reason enough to have consolidation, that whole idea that bigger is better and that it will make things cheaper? So there really was not just, well, we don't really care so much about the legislation any longer, and it's okay for mergers, but rather there's kind of a different ideology there that says, hey, so long as prices are cheaper, we don't care what happens to labor, we don't care what happens to society, we don't care what happens to entrepreneurship. We just want consumers to have cheaper goods. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. I mean, the anti monopoly laws and tradition represent a certain vision of America, a certain vision of our economy, where, as you noted, independent businesses, small farmers, small merchants would all get a fair shot. Similarly, workers would have freedom. They would have choice. They would, be able to choose among employers. If they wanted to go set out on their own, they would be able to. And similarly, consumers would not be captive to the whims of a single company, to the extent that there was a recognition that in some industries you do have monopolies, natural monopolies, because of the huge economies of scale. Sure, we weren't going to have competition there, but then we were going to regulate them to make sure they could not arbitrarily hike prices or cut off people. And the Reagan administration's pivot, you're absolutely right, was premised on a new philosophy where they basically said, whereas previously there was a skepticism towards monopoly. I mean, it was the anti monopoly tradition. Monopolies were presumed to result in a whole bunch of harms that made we had to be skeptical of them. Now, monopolies almost became presumptively good because there was an assumption that being bigger, having more economies of scale would create efficiencies that these companies would, of course, pass on to their consumers, to their trading partners. And the view was that if they started abusing their power, that power would be instantly checked by this flood of new entrants into the market. And there were a whole bunch of reasons why those assumptions were deeply flawed. And one of the things that we've seen over the last few decades is just how wrong they got it. We've seen, in fact, that bigger is not always better. Bigger can be less efficient. And even if they are generating cost savings, they're not going to have any incentive to pass that on to other people.
Right. And it doesn't help consumers necessarily, and certainly not labor and society and the environment and so on. Now, you were an early identifier of the problems with that idea that came, I think, originally from Robert Bork, did it not?
Yes, Robert Bork became kind of the symbolic, intellectual father of this pivot and of owning the idea that bigger could actually be better.
And you early on identified the problems with that. Now, can you walk us through what you saw as the problems and how you took that understanding into the Biden administration?
Yeah, I mean, there are a whole bunch of problems. I mean, it starts with lack of fidelity to what Congress has actually said is the purpose of the law. I mean, just the radical pivot and the ability to not just ignore the antitrust laws, but actually to use them in the service of facilitating monopolies rather than checking them was a unbelievably radical and ideological move that had no basis in what Congress had actually said the purpose of these laws was or the text of the laws was. And so candidly, pretty flagrant lawlessness in certain regards. And when the Bork Revolution first started happening, you absolutely had commentators, sometimes even judges saying this seems lawless in certain ways. The other main criticism was that the core assumptions they were making did not correspond to reality. The way that markets actually work are not reflected in their models and theories. And so we started to do more and more research showcasing the huge gap between how Bork said markets would work and what would happen when monopolies were formed and what actually happened, which is that prices were often higher. There's been an increase in the profit margins that firms have been earning as their markets have become more
Mhm.
consolidated, oftentimes. Workers have less power. As a result, oftentimes they're making less or their wages are more stagnant. New business formation will fall. Newer firms have less opportunity to enter markets. Innovation can also fall. Markets also become more fragile. And we saw this during the pandemic, where a single shock or a single supply chain issue can have cascading effects because when you're concentrating production, you're also concentrating risk. We saw this even with infant formula a few years ago, where there was a single contamination in a single factory of one company. And that meant we had nationwide shortages of infant formula in the United States in 2022. And so it really showcases all sorts of downsides that the Bork models just don't account for and don't model for. And I think that huge gap between their theories and what reality shows is what created more momentum to really do a pivot and correct for their mistakes.